Institute, the Romanian Minister for European Affairs, Victor Negrescu, Mona Siddiqui from the University of Edinburgh, Alex Deane from FTI Consulting, and Karen Lanlow from Centre of the European Policy Studies. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Web Forum to discuss Will Europe Rise Again? Now, the assumption in the question is that Europe has fallen. And that's not an assumption that I would accept. But what we can certainly say is Europe has had a very tough 10 years, much tougher than it has in its entire history. It's had the euro crisis, the refugee crisis, the slow erosion of its welfare systems, Brexit, the shock of Brexit in 2016. So the EU has certainly confronted quite a lot of very fundamental problems over the recent period. Of course, the EU does not represent all of Europe and geographic Europe, but it does represent the closest relationships between countries on the European continent and in the greater European area. So what we'd like to do today is look at what the issues facing the EU are today and Europe more widely, and then how we see the next 5 years developing. Of all of the crises, probably the most serious one the EU faces and still faces is the political volatility and uncertainty that runs right across democratic politics in Europe. Populism and populists are stronger in Europe today than at any period in the post-war history. This is a different time. But on the other hand, we shouldn't exaggerate the role of populists and populism. The centre has broadly held in most, but not all countries. So let's begin our conversation and we see where it takes us. So Alex, if I could begin with you. You're a communication specialist. So you know how big ideas should be communicated and how political ideas should be communicated. What is your judgment of the political communication capacity of the EU and how do you think it could be improved?
It's woeful. But I suppose I'm here not just because I work for FTI, but also because I took a sabbatical from my firm to run one of the Leave campaigns in my country when we had our referendum about membership of the European Union. And from that perspective, like all Eurosceptics, I must quibble, as you rightly did in your opening remarks, with the notion that the EU is symmetrical with the notion of Europe. Europe is full of great positive ideas in communications terms and in great values terms. Europe is a place of tremendous cultural and artistic achievement, a place of tremendous liberal values. And I wouldn't disassociate myself as a British person for one moment from those things. I think that's part of what makes the British people profoundly European. The problem, as I see it, is with the institutions of the European Union, and their communications are binary. If there is anything that's good, it's because of the European Union. If there's anything that's bad, it means you need more Europe. You need to have more or closer union binding people closer together. And I distinguish, I'm afraid, myself from your remarks about populism thus. You assume that populism is bad. And when you take that attitude, inevitably you establish a kind of political elite, if you will, that inevitably in the end is going to lose the attention or the will of the people. That is to say, populism, things that attract the approval of the people of a country or a people of a place, must necessarily have something wrong with it. I actually disagree with that quite strongly, and I'm a big believer in democracy. So I think that we sneer at things being populist at our peril.
But it's not necessary, but populism, if populism means being anti-immigration, being xenophobic, there isn't also a downside and a dark side.
Of course, you can use populism as a synonym for things I don't like, which is what that question implies. But the extent to which in my country the referendum campaign to leave the European Union was portrayed as being anti-immigrant or xenophobic, it assisted that campaign. It assisted the campaign to leave because most people were smart enough to see beyond that and see that this was an argument about the future of the United Kingdom.
I think the data suggests, in fact, immigration played an important role, and that's evidence.
I don't disagree with that.
Mona, you also come from the United Kingdom and from a part of the United Kingdom that voted to remain in the EU from Scotland. But can you talk a little about what it now feels in terms of being British?
Yeah, sure.
A British citizen in a very different relationship with the rest of the continent.
Well, just to follow on, I chaired the Scotland Stronger in Europe campaign. And the reason I chaired it was simply because despite all the distinctions we make between the EU and Europe, leaving the EU is also saying something to the rest of Europe. So you can't have it both ways. But I think that issues like, what does populism mean? Why has populism become such a bad word? Are actually quite contentious issues because populism started in the 1950s as a desire to return to a more pure politics. And we are seeing anything but a pure politics. And we are seeing anything but a naive politics. So I have many colleagues who are, if I can say it, they're white British nationals. They're not people like myself who feel British but came in the 1960s and 70s, who feel that the UK doesn't feel like their home anymore. Now, it could be passing. It could just be the consequence of the shock of Brexit. But actually, I think that the way you feel a citizen relies very much on the way you feel with one another. The state can have all kinds of narratives, and the state can have all kinds of political dimensions. But actually, what makes you feel a citizen, what makes you feel part of a bigger whole, is down to the relationships you have with one another. And I think for many people, the feeling is, I don't know about the reality, but the feeling is that relationships are being eroded. It's not just obviously because of Brexit, but the way there is a kind of almost polarity in politics now, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in the States, that somehow there's a them and us in Europe, and there's a them and us and politics has become binary. I think that's actually quite toxic for Europe.
Minister, you're at the heart of negotiation on the future of this Europe's Union. So how do you see the big issues and problems that confront the system?
First of all, I'm really happy to be here at the Web Summit. And of course, it's important to discuss. We cannot hear the mic. No. Yeah, I think I have to open the mic. Just a second. You can hear me or not?
Yeah, that's better.
Yes,
yeah,
we
perfect.
hear you now.
So my introduction was skills in the beginning. I was saying that I was happy to be here at the Web Summit. And of course, we have to speak about how we can engage better with people. Actually, what happened with Brexit is an example of the need to reinforce our cooperation and our contact with citizens. And the reason why I brought this cable and this phone is to illustrate what we believe should happen. Basically, what we have currently is that we have the European citizens. They are the plug of the European project. They bring the energy, and we need it, of course, to make the machine, which is the European Union, working. Of course, the machine looks fine. It looks good from our side. It's an innovative one. It's a new brand, something new. But what we have to define currently is, first of all, is that we need to define the cable and make things working better between the plug, which are the European citizens, of course, and the machine, which is the European Union. Basically, because we are here at the Web Summit, I illustrate things this way, because we need something that connects people with the machine, which is the European Union. And furthermore, we need an app, a new instrument, a new tool that will enable us to work, to make things working better. Because let's say directly, after 60 years in the creation of the European Union, the European Union is a success story. But from time to time, we need to speak about how we can redefine it in making it working better, more useful, and of course more in touch with people requests. And it's something quite interesting that when you look at the polls, people expect the European Union to do more in terms of education and healthcare. but the European Union doesn't have any competencies in education and healthcare. You look again at statistics. You see Erasmus is the most popular program of the European Union, which is in education where the European Union doesn't have any competencies. So contrary to what my colleague said earlier, I don't think the issue is about whether or not we should move things to the European Union or not. The issue is for the European Union and the member states that compose the European Union to deliver what people expect from us. And of course, it's up to us to be very frank about it. I think the times when we were only speaking about the good sides has finished. Today we have to be very pragmatic about the European Union, see what will be the future of the European Union, and involve citizens in this debate. So this idea of having debates with citizens across Europe, it's an important element. And of course, we should not debate only with the elites that are in the capitals. We should move the debate also around our countries, everywhere, in rural areas, in smaller towns, in the peripheries of our towns, involve young people and old people as well. It's not a problem of generation. Too many times we're speaking about the fact that young people are pro-Europeans and older people are not so pro-Europeans. It's not about that. It's really about involving them and making sure that our message, the message about the European Union and the strong points of European Union reaches out everyone, and especially people like here that I see that are drinking wine and maybe do not have so much time to look at directives and look at European regulations. They are sitting down, chilling, looking at a debate, but we have to give them information that is useful for them and in the same time attractive for them.
So, Alex, can I go back to you? Because you obviously favoured the UK leaving the EU, and you've achieved that. The UK has issued its Article 50. It is on the way out. What relationship do you see in the context of the red lines of the British government available to it? But also, how do you see the negotiations going in the context of probably the most volatile politics I have seen in the UK in a very, very long time?
Well, it's hard to disagree with your point about volatility. I think that the British government, of which I of course don't speak any more than I speak for my firm in this context, I think the British government wants to get back towards the kind of trading relationship that many in the United Kingdom felt the relationship with the EU or the European Economic Community as it was then when we went in the first place. But on the other hand, to be able to control migration. And that's why, in the end, we were always going to have to leave the single market and leave the customs union, because understandably, the European Union's position is you have to take all or nothing and you can't pick and choose, and that's fair enough. And the position of the United Kingdom was always, given that we voted to leave, going to be that we had to return control of migration, those who come to our country, and we get to decide that to ourselves. The difficult thing in this discussion, as was displayed by our interchange just now, is that some people, I think, have an inability to distinguish between an interest in migration or thinking that your country should be able to control immigration and xenophobia and racism. Now, I think most people in a country are able to distinguish between those things. Some observers and some elites are not. But to be clear, the extent to which people were called racist for being concerned about migration in my country, that helped the Leave campaign. Being sneered at, just as I think we saw in the Trump campaign, is very helpful to a campaign in a referendum or election.
But can I move you back to what you think the relationship between the UK and the EU will be, given the red lines that the United Kingdom has put on the table?
Yeah, I think it's more likely than not that we achieve some kind of trade deal. And I think that we wind up with transition agreements, especially on key areas like automotive or financial services. And then anyone who pretends they can they can project what's going to happen 5 years down the line is pulling the wool over your eyes. But I certainly think 1 to 2 years from now, we'll have got to the position where we can agree transition agreements in those areas to keep commerce flowing. And to be clear, if you look at the negotiations as they're happening now, they're actually far more functional and far more normal in terms of trade negotiations on the ground and between the parties than media discussions of them may suggest. Progress is being made on both sides and between the parties. And in the end, of course, these parties are setting out kind of blustery positions when they come out and talk in the media. That's what happens in all kinds of arguments before you narrow down towards the convergence on what you agree.
Can I just go directly to the Minister on this? Because in a way, what Alex is saying is that there is a deal available, that there are two sides, that they're blustering. But the EU isn't blustering in the sense that the EU is rule-bound. It has a legal a very important legal system, the glue that holds it together. So do you think that it will be quite as easy for the UK as Alex is suggesting?
Yeah,
I didn't say it was going to be easy.
I often discuss with my British
you did on the
my British friends, and I'm telling them what I'm telling you right now. The European Union is not bluffing. It's not bluffing in these negotiations. What we request is what we want and what we have to obtain for everyone. So, for instance, we are ready to give British citizens the same rights that they had as European citizens. You should do the same. Great Britain could do the same for European citizens.
We already have.
And of course, this should not be only related in terms of rhetoric. We need clear guarantees. And clear guarantees mean guarantees not asking people, European citizens that live in UK, to complete a file.
This discussion should be based on reality.
To complete a file that is 80 pages long, of course. And let's defer to details.
What you said isn't true, so
and of
that's
course,
a bit of a showstopper.
Yeah, it's true because I was there. I was there last week, and I discussed with people, European citizens that live there, that tell me that. So let's go out of the rhetoric. We want fair and good relations with Great Britain in the future.
The UK's position is that EU nationals get to keep their rights.
Of course, let's go out of what you are saying. This is rhetoric. Let's go to concrete things. And going back to concrete things, everyone, all European member states, and especially my country, want good relations with Great Britain afterwards. Great Britain is an important partner. We would have loved to see Great Britain being still a member of the European Union. You made this decision. We are negotiating. All member states are united and have a common position. And that common position is expressed by our negotiator, and our negotiator, we trust him, Mr. Barnier, to express our points of view, but also, in order to reach an agreement, and this should not be forgotten, all member states have to agree with the outcome. All member states. So therefore, every member state is important in these negotiations. We have to discuss about the three first topics. We have to finish with the three first topics to pass on to the next discussion about the future cooperation. We hope that we can reach an outcome. We are waiting in the future second rounds of 2 rounds of negotiation to reach a positive outcome, and we expect the British government to come up with positive results and proposals.
Mona.
So, with all respect, I don't know which British government you're looking at. The current British government can't even control its own cabinet, never mind have negotiations with the rest of the EU. So I'm actually on the side of our European partners. We made this horrendous decision. We are going to have to reap the consequences of whether you make this distinction, we're not leaving Europe, we're leaving the EU. At the moment, the biggest thing that's giving Britain volatility is the fact that we've made this decision with no real transition plan, with no real sense of what will happen with the various outcomes. And, you know, why should Europe make it easy for us? You're assuming that Europe will make it easy for us because we're a big player. Yes, we are a big player. But why would they? Because the whole premise of the EU, the whole premise of the EU is that they don't want the EU to unravel. They don't want other countries to have the referendum to vote. And so why should that club, which is having to negotiate equal rights for everyone, decide that, no, we've got a soft spot for Britain. They've made a stupid decision, but we'll give them some extra rights.
We agree to an extent. We agree that it was outrageous of our country to call a referendum which had binary outcomes, remain or stay, and make no provision for one of the two sides of that outcome. That was obviously ridiculous from our government. But what I don't understand, more than a year after the referendum, is why some people would prefer to side with the other side in a negotiating process from the United Kingdom, rather than with their own country.
So can I say we're not...
That's a negotiation, isn't it?
We're not into comparative loyalty to member states here.
I think we are a bit.
No. Can I just
move?
I want to move beyond Brexit because, frankly, Brexit is not the #1 topic in most capitals in Europe today. It happens to be in the country I come from because I'm Irish, and so for Ireland, Brexit is a catastrophe and dangerous. But for most of the other member states, Brexit is not the top priority. So, Minister, can I ask you, thinking of Macron and his speech on European sovereignty and on all of the reform issues that are on the table, where do you see this going for the EU 27 in the next 5 years?
Yeah, there are these different proposals on the table, and of course we evaluate all of them. There are proposals made by the President of the Commission, the President of the Council, and of course it's good that we have a debate. So after many years, we really have a debate about the future of Europe, and I think this is quite important. And this is why I'm coming back to what I said at the beginning, that we need to involve citizens in this debate to reach a positive outcome. We hope that soon we can come up with a real proposal on the future of the European Union. The European Union can become more democratic, can become more powerful, can increase its competitivity by doing more things together. So therefore, one of the most important things to do is to generate measures or instruments that will enable us to communicate more between each other. Today, sometimes we underline too much the existence of divisions. And I can tell you very frankly, Romania, my country, which is going to be the 6th biggest country after Brexit in the European Union, doesn't believe in division. No division between East and West or North and South. There is only a lack of communication and, of course, lack of trust sometimes. And I think we have to change that. And, of course, by discussing, by engaging in an open debate about the future of Europe, we can rebuild this trust and rebuild the European Union as a project that has many years to go in front of it.
As you know, there are deep concerns about developments both in Hungary and Poland in terms of the upholding the rule of law and about the benchmarks of European values. Given that Eastern enlargement has been such a success, how do you account for the rise of a liberal democracy in these two countries in particular?
Of course, it's not my place to comment what is happening in one country. What's important to discuss about is about the common European values. And indeed, we need an active debate about the common European values. And they are mentioned there in the treaty. At the beginning of the treaty, I don't know how many people are actually looking at that. They are mentioned. And we speak about solidarity. We speak about rule of law. We speak about all the principles that unite us. And of course, it's not, we shouldn't only speak about them. We should also create instruments that enable them to reinforce them in all member states. And of course, when it comes to the respect for the rule of law, I think all countries should engage with the Commission and with other member states. And I can tell you very frankly, of course, my country, for 10 years already, discussed with the Commission about the laws that relate to the implementation of the rule of law. Maybe we don't do always the best things, but it's important to keep the communication. It's important to communicate with the Commission, communicate with the member states about that, be very open about that. I think we have to reinforce this communication between those member states, between the citizens of those states, with the Commission, with the other member states, of course, to reinforce the principles of democracy. I think this is key. Democracy is key for the European Union to continue to exist. And of course, we have to discuss frankly about that. And I have to underline this fact. I think democratic leaders or people that believe in democratic values are sometimes too shy in speaking out loud what they believe about democracy and what they want out of democracy. And we should be more frank, more direct, and promote more our values. We shouldn't be scared of them. And you mentioned populists. Populists are not scared of shouting out loud, interrupting people that speak in the same panel. They speak loud, and they are not afraid of that. We should be also very courageous in speaking out loud our mind and defending our values.
Mona, do you want to...
Just to follow on from that, I think one of the issues has become in politics is that we're not going to get away from the nation state for the time being. But what does Europe stand for? What is Europe's story? So democracy you can have in many countries, but what we're really talking about is liberal democracies, where rule of law, commitment to pluralism are not goods in themselves, but they have to be negotiated. And I think that to some extent, there's a sense that for some people, history no longer matters, that history is linear and that it's all about technology and progress, and that Europe will get there. But actually, there's another story on the fringes of Europe, and in some cases, as we're seeing in Spain, in the center of Europe, which wants a different story. So it's not simply about democracy, it's about a particular kind of democracy. It's not simply about the right to vote. It's what makes a liberal democracy worth fighting for, what it's struggling for. And I think that to some extent, Europe may have lost its way. It may have become too settled in what gave it prominence post-war, and to think that actually things and people and mindsets have shifted dramatically in the last 10, 20 years. And I think in that sense, I don't see a coherent narrative in Europe, and I think it's lost its way to a certain extent.
I mean, how do you respond to someone like Emmanuel Macron, who did fight the European fight? He said, I want to talk about Europe, and no one any longer defends Europe. And
Yeah.
by that he meant the cooperative systems of the EU. And interestingly, Marine Le Pen lost on the European issue in the election. So Europe was not seen as a problem for him in the election. In fact, it helped him. But how do you see his vision of the EU in terms of a European sovereignty, defence and security, the Eurozone, more solidarity? How do you respond to Macron's Europe?
Well, I mean, in some ways, you have two stories of Europe then. You have the Europe that is strengthened through unity, through cooperation. And then you have the Europe that, for some of the more right-wing parties, that came close to winning but didn't win, which is that Europe is defunct. The EU is defunct. And of course, although we try in our head to intellectualize this, the EU is separate from Europe, in common parlance, very often they collide. So those people who say that the EU is defunct, that Europe should be about individual borders, individual sovereignty, less cooperation, I don't think they have an alternative what that would look like, how that would strengthen their own nation states. And in a time where people need to build more communities across borders, I think it's very easy to say we want sovereignty, we want control, but what does that look like when the world is already so connected in all kinds of ways?
So Macron's vision of Europe.
Well, his vision is a bit like this panel. It's extraordinary that we're having this conversation as if it's business as usual, rather than there are economic realities within the European Union which have disastrous overtones. You described Brexit as disastrous and catastrophic in your role as impartial chair without giving me the ability to come back. But let me talk about the economy in the EU.
I said for Ireland.
You said for Ireland, as if that was a given, and you can speak for your country. Well, let me speak more broadly then and try and widen the debate. With the GDP of many countries in the European Union can never catch up with the debt that they have built. It is a classic debt trap. If you open your school textbook, it says devalue. But these countries can't devalue because they're in a common currency. Greece on that spectrum is already off the end of the scale. But there are several other member states which are not that far behind. We can have panels like this at nice organisations like Web Summit until the rubber really hits the road there. But I think it would probably be better for the European Union and those people who operate within it, even people elected or sent by their own countries to represent their national interests and then use the term we to describe the EU rather than their own country. If those people might spend a little more time looking at the economic reality rather than the window dressing of the comms plan, they'd prefer to describe why they need more Europe.
Well, I think that it is fair to say that the slowest growing economy in the EU today is the United Kingdom. It is actually...
In one quarter.
It is in the last 4.
That's not true.
It is slower than Greece now. And of course, Greece has huge problems. But to say that all...
You think they're comparable, those two economies?
No, of course not. But to say that all the economic problems are just in the rest of the EU is also an exaggeration.
Oh, we can make a mess of things without the help of the EU. Every member state can do that. For sure.
Has very serious economic problems.
Yeah, it always surprises me how we like to use data for something against something else. But I want to underline some data about European countries. So, for instance, my country has a 6%, is going to have a 6% economic growth. It has the biggest economic growth in the European Union, so it's a huge one. But Portugal as well, we have here the Secretary of State in charge of Europe. They have a more than 2% economic growth, so it's a success story there in the Eurozone.
And
so there is the reason, and it works. So of course, if bad decisions are made, by governments, the governments have to see how they can find the solutions for that. Of course, we are responsible for what we do in our country. Every country is responsible for what it does in its own country. But together at European level, we can find sometimes solutions. And we have to say that dealing with the economic crisis, we try to find solutions. Maybe not the best one, but it was better to be together than be separately. So I think, indeed, the European Union offers advantages, and we have to fix the problems that may exist. And I really think, because let's refer back to the relation with the UK, I think we have a future of good cooperation with the United Kingdom. And this is clear. But the idea is to define it in a frank way and not transform it yet again in a new debate about Brexit and a new debate about personal and individual interest. It's a debate about the future of Europe, not only European Union. And of course, we have to be very frank about it and of course discuss openly all these issues and not misuse data, because also in the Brexit debate, there were data from what we saw that were misused, that were not correct. And of course, this turns back to the idea that the moderator underlined at the beginning, being populist about some topics. Populist means misusing data, misinforming people, and we have to change that. We have the responsibility to be very clear with the people, tell them what's bad, what's good, and of course, be very open with them.
I mean, one of the issues is, just slightly broaden this out, is that all of us are looking for leadership on the world stage. We're looking for people who can not just speak to their own nation states and interests, even in the EU, but actually say something about all the crises that are enveloping the world in all kinds of ways, not just economic crises. And I think that at the moment, there isn't a world leader in any country. There isn't a person who is, or a country, or an institution that is saying that we have to think what's good for the majority of people in the world, not just for our own nation states' interests. And my own fear is that having grown up against a backdrop of the EU and having taken advantage of all the rights that the EU has given, I just don't see where the alternative solution is in terms of leadership, in terms of a brighter future. I mean, we can say till the cows come home, oh, no, it's going to be all right in 2 years' time. After the transition deal, in any country that leaves, not just the UK, if any country were to leave, that we will have a brighter future. But the price that we're going to pay for that brighter economic future, A, is not guaranteed, but the costs might be huge. And I don't know where you would turn to, where is stable in terms of coming to help the EU when it becomes unstable. And I think that's a huge price to pay.
If such a global leader were to be anointed, where would their mandate come from?
Well, no, it's not about a single person. I'm just talking about even the United States, that is really not going to be any great friend of the UK once it leaves the EU. It will look after its own interests, often sees itself as providing an ethical, moral discourse, the world leader. But all I'm saying is that what we're seeing is if you give people the choice of certain decisions and say that's the will of the people, this isn't necessarily democracy. This is actually saying to people, this is a very complex problem, but we're trusting you to make the right judgments. Most people don't have any idea, including me, of how to make the right judgments about lots of things.
Having fought and lost the referendum, you don't think we should have had one?
No, I don't think we should have had one.
Right.
Absolutely. Because I think it was too complex a decision to leave. And let's be honest, the referendum was about Tory party infighting. It wasn't about the will of the people. The fact that it ended up being a vote to leave is still about Tory party infighting.
If your side had won, you'd say this is a great mandate for the EU for the rest of all time. You wouldn't be saying any of this, would you?
No, because I didn't want to leave the EU.
So we're actually coming to an end. And what I found extraordinary is I hadn't anticipated that we would be talking about the United Kingdom at this panel in quite the extent that we have. Can I end by saying that one of the great paradoxes of Brexit is it actually is a living field experiment in how you de-globalize and de-Europeanize. And what we've discovered in the process of the negotiations, and have yet to discover, is that this is extremely difficult in a highly interdependent world. And the United Kingdom is facing, when it comes to all sorts of policy areas, including the fact that it won't have full membership of Europol, that there were advantages in being involved in cooperative arrangements with other member states. The view that you can regain sovereignty of the traditional old type in a world of deep interdependence, unfortunately, in my view, would be proven wrong. And what we see today is sovereignty is about a capacity to influence, a seat at the table and voice. And to withdraw from that, you could be right. The United Kingdom may fly into global Britain. It may, but it may not. And the cost of the experiment, because it really is it's a field experiment. And social scientists will look at these negotiations in 100 years' time, and historians. It could be that the cost to the United Kingdom, but also to the EU, is high, but much higher to the United Kingdom. And we simply don't know. And what I find interesting is that usually politicians and governments take risk seriously. and they don't take gambles. And in my view, the United Kingdom as a country is launched on a very large gamble, the outcome of which remains extremely open. And I really don't know what we will say about this in 5, 10, 15 years' time. But what we really are seeing is a live experiment in de-Europeanisation and deglobalisation, at least in the short term. And for a country to do that with as pragmatic a political culture that the United Kingdom has is historically unprecedented. And I go back to what Mona said when she said a lot of this was generated initially within the Conservative Party and a battle for the soul of the Conservative Party. And it's interesting that battle continues today because that party is as riven on this issue today as it was 5 years ago. It will continue to be riven. On that, I'd like to thank everyone for being here, thank all of the panelists for their engagement, and enjoy the rest of the Web Summit. Thank you.